All right, so let's begin. Bismillah. Science and scientism. Now, the first thing I like to talk about is definitions. That's the first thing anyone should do, especially when going to philosophical inquiry. And the reason that definitions are important is because you don't really understand what's going on unless, of course, you understand your terms. Now, before going to that as well, two things. This is probably going to be one of the most important topics you learn when trying to understand atheism. And I'm not just saying that because I'm teaching the course, but yes, if you want me to flatter myself, that's fine. The reason this is the most important subject is because this deals with the epistemology, or the way in which atheists understand the world. Most atheists today, most contemporary atheists, believe that most or all knowledge can be derived from science itself, from the methodology of science itself. So if you do not understand science or how atheists think about science, then you won't understand atheism at all, or how atheists think in general. Secondly, disclaimer, even after this course, you're not going to know everything about science and scientism. This is a very basic course. We're not going to get through much within 2 hours. We're going to do as best as we can. But this should give you some foundation. All right, so let's begin with definitions. All right. Oh, actually, first, Thomas Kuhn, one of my favorite philosophers, and he said something very wise, and it doesn't seem like it's wise, but think about it. The answer you get depends on the questions you ask, and I hope that people ask many, many, many questions during this lecture. You don't have to ask them at the end of the lecture. You can ask them anytime. You can even ask them about random things. I like to rant, so that's fine as well, as long as it's not too off topic. Okay. We'll be discussing Thomas Kuhn later as well. What is science? Okay, first definition should be basic enough, right? All right, you guys need to know this. The intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. That's it. For those of you who may be science majors, maybe in the medical field, this shouldn't be surprising to you in the least. All right, so let's move on to the next definition, which is going to be the most important one we're going to be discussing. Here we go. What is scientism? All right, so what's the difference? The belief that the methods of natural science, or the categories and things recognized in natural science, form the only proper elements in any philosophical or other inquiry. In other words, for concise format, science is the only or best way to know anything. That's it. That's really the only part you have to memorize there. But that's the general definition of scientism. Now, before going into the nature of scientism, the specifics about what science and scientism are, I want to discuss kind of how science influences the way that we think and how we perceive it in the contemporary period. So, is scientism a big deal? Is it something that we're just like making up right now? Is it something that has no real manifestation in the world? Is it something that people even think about? Well, honestly, most people are affected by this belief system, whether they explicitly believe it or it's just sort of like something that they've sort of subconsciously had from education or from the surrounding culture. So all of us are actually affected by this concept known as scientism. So let me show you how that is the case. Firstly, though, this is what atheists generally think about science. Okay? So here we have one of the new atheists, one of the well-known atheists among the new atheist crowd, you know, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens. His name was Victor Stenger, the late Victor Stenger, and he pretty much concisely summarized what new atheists believe about science and the concept of God. And he said, the new atheists firmly insist that the personal Abrahamic or Islamic God is a scientific hypothesis that can be tested by the standard methods of science. So they honestly believe, most of the atheists today, that the concept of God and religion, everything else that comes with it, is actually a scientific hypothesis. They actually believe this. So this is the more explicit form of scientism coming out. So let's see how it affects us. What's the attraction to science? Many of you think about science every day. You just don't realize it, or when you do, you think about it in a very different manner. Power. The attraction to science has a lot to do with power. What does that mean? Well, let's think about what are the most powerful nations in the world today? The ones with what? The biggest weapons, most technology, most economic power, right? That's one of the biggest ways in which science influences us. We don't realize it. Technology, I already mentioned. Communication, what we're doing right now, how I'm communicating with all of you, is actually quite amazing if you think about it. Did you know that we've only had this technology for what, the past, what was it? Has it been since the 90s? Not even. That's amazing. We take it for granted, but you have to really consider how much we've advanced technologically over the past few decades. I remember when the first cell phones came out, they were bigger than my head. Yeah, that was really embarrassing. Nobody wanted one back then. It was like the first time when the iPad came out. Nobody really wanted to carry that big thing, but now everyone has it. Thankfully, they got smaller as well. Anyways, so yeah, and the internet's an amazing thing. Before email, guess how we communicate with each other? It's insane. A lot of you are too young to remember that. I remember working on the first Mac. That was horrible. It was nice back then, but it was horrible in comparison, to now. Health. We live in the first time in human history where you can be as unhealthy as possible and still live to average age. That's amazing. So eat as many Twinkies as you want, people, because you will live up to 70. Wealth, something we already kind of mentioned. Being able to process wealth, being able to earn wealth through our technology, through the healthcare. It's horrible here in the United States, though. A lot of exploitation, occurring through the insurance companies, etc. But wealth. So the attraction to science has a lot to do with all of these. And when we see all of this, we kind of have this idea in our minds that it has to do with our ethics or our cultural values. They're almost the same thing, Like the reason that we have all this power and technology and health and wealth is because we are in some way or another virtuous or civilized, So the worldly benefits of scientific and technological output allows people to feel a sense of power, control, and superiority over those who lack such things. The correlation between a society's ideas and this output often creates a necessary causal link in the mind between the two. In other words, a face value evaluation is made without concern for other factors that lead to these results. So when we look at the world, when we look at our scientific progress, we often think to ourselves how advanced we are, how awesome we are. But we don't ever think about the values behind those things. We don't think about how we got to that point. So let me kind of wake you guys up a little bit. But what about this? Pollution. We've been having some major problems in the world today with pollution. Why are we not considering that part of our scientific advancement? Why do we think, when we think about science, why do we not think about this aspect? Why do we focus on all the benefits, cell phones, but we don't focus on how that technology and how those things are made and what the damage is doing to our environment? Even when you look on the media, when they talk about pollution, when they talk about the ozone layer, do they blame any aspects of the scientific enterprise, or do they blame humans? They blame specifically humanity, humans' own errors. And of course, that's a rational thing to do, but they never tie it to science. The only time science is ever tied to anything, usually, is when it causes a benefit. Is that a realistic picture? Not really, because science, even when it causes benefits, is still the hands of humans, right? But you never hear it from that perspective. You always hear science is doing this, but you never hear what people are doing necessarily. There's never a human hand. It's always shown as sort of this objective, neutral thing outside, that's causing all these benefits, but is completely separated from the negativity. At least that's how media presents it. So pollution. We have a huge pollution problem in the world today. Actually, if you didn't already know this, the ozone layer is actually correcting itself now, alhamdulillah. But and hopefully eventually we're all going to switch to electric cars anyway. So it'll heal itself even further, and hopefully global warming will get less of an issue. But yeah, we had snow. I live in the South here in America, and we had 3 days of snow. Like, it wasn't really thick, but it was enough to be like, okay, why am I living down here? It's supposed to be warm. So you can see that even the environment, when you look around, it's becoming a lot more varied in terms of temperatures and in terms of weather conditions. And even the hurricanes are getting horrible now. Have you seen the size of the hurricanes? It's huge. Okay, go online later on after this lecture, look online about the size of hurricanes, and you can see there's a massive difference over the past 10, 20 years. Literally, hurricane sizes have doubled. It's incredible. All right, so let's move on. What else? WMDs. I think this is self-explanatory, but let me make this clear that a lot of people don't think about this aspect of science, unless, of course, they're only talking about warfare. But most people in their day-to-day lives do not think of science in this way. But this is one of the major impacts of scientific enterprise over the past couple of years. Now, going back to history again, many of you are too young. I'm too young to remember this, but I've studied history. But World War II wasn't that long ago, guys. It wasn't that long ago. It was less than 100 years ago. And the atomic bombs, pictures of those which you're seeing right here, weren't dropped very long ago. And they killed hundreds of thousands of people. This is a reality that many of you take for granted. And believe it or not, many of the major powers in the world are only powerful because they have hundreds of these lying around underground. That's a very disturbing thing. Next, exploitation. We don't think about that either. We look at our food production values, we look at the way in which our technology is made. But if you actually think about where you're getting your phones, if you think about where you're getting most of your technology, it's not in a very ethical manner. I feel guilty for holding this right now. But it's not a very ethical manner. Most of the scientific achievements that we have in terms of technology were built by the hands of individuals who do not have the same rights as you or I. For instance, children. If you go in many of the Southeast Asian countries, I've traveled the world a bit, so I've seen a lot of these things. Like in Malaysia, you find that a lot of people who are not of the age to be working are working. And a lot of exploitation is occurring with immigrant labor and things like this. A lot of the technology you have, which I'm not trying to make everyone feel guilty, but it's produced in a very unethical manner. But we don't understand it that way because the way that we perceive science, once again, is separated from the values of a society. Okay, so there is little concern for these atrocities and more focus on the benefits they produce. While there is a minority attempting to stop these horrible practices, many individuals living in scientifically advanced societies have little to no concern. So in a way, this is how scientism kind of affects us in an indirect manner by allowing us to separate our understanding of science from the ethics behind it. We'll get into the reason why in a moment here. And the reason I'm speaking about scientism first, because before I get into what science is, I have to explain what science is not. Because a lot of you guys have been indoctrinated, including myself at one point, about what science is, and it's not that way at all. So if you believe in scientism, then you do not understand science. Okay? So yes, if you're wondering if I'm accusing some of these atheists who follow scientism of not understanding science, I'm doing exactly that. And I can, because I'm a philosopher. I'm allowed to do those things. We're the most annoying people on the planet. You'll figure out why in a moment. If you ever go to a gathering of scientists and there's a philosopher there, he's always by himself. What is the purpose behind this? Why is this occurring? How is this occurring? We don't just especially philosophers of science, we don't just want to do the science. We don't just want to see the science. We don't just want to see the product of science. We want to be able to understand how it got there, what the thought process was. You know, what is a theory, for example? What does that mean? We're going to explain what that is later as well. You know, we want to understand what is a fact. Why is science beneficial? Why is it not beneficial in certain respects? You know, where does it get us? Is science progressive? Things like this. And only philosophers ask those questions. And this is why scientists are annoyed by us, is because, you know, all they want to do is sit in their labs all day. No offense to them. I mean, you know, they do good work. But sometimes you need a father figure looking over you. So let's see what the three aspects of scientism are, so that you guys understand a little better. And after this, we're going to go into the history of scientism. You know, the history behind how this thought process began and where it ended up. So the three aspects of scientism are: 1, realism; 2, positivism; and 3, progressionism. It's a progressive understanding of science. So what are these three things? Well, let's start with realism first. Okay. Cue awesome graphics. Boom, boom. All right, here we go. Scientific theories are actual and true representations of reality independent of human biases, i.e. objective. Okay, so this is the first definition of the first aspect of what is scientism. It's called realism, scientific realism. Once again, scientific theories are actual and true representations of reality independent of human bias. They are objective, meaning whatever theories we've constructed, whether it be about gravity, whatever else, theory of evolution, for example, is an actual representation of how reality is. Okay? Independent of whatever you or I think about it. It doesn't matter what we think. It doesn't matter how we perceive it. That's how it is. Okay? Seems like common sense, right? That's how most people think about science, to be honest. Okay, so let's move on. Next, positivism. And this is really the heart of scientism here, so I need you guys to remember this specifically. We're going to be talking about positivism a lot more later. This is a big definition. Science corresponds with rationality itself and is the only means to verify the truths and meanings of every possible statement and explanation. There are no metaphysical assumptions or reasons behind scientific thought. So if you had a class with Ustaz Hamza, was it last week, a few days ago? He talked about metaphysical assumptions. According to scientism, when they have this aspect of positivism in there are no metaphysical assumptions. There is no metaphysics. It doesn't exist. There are no abstractions. Mathematics, for example, it's not. It's just symbols. Things like that. There are no, like, meaning is not this abstract thing. Everything that I'm saying right now, for you to understand it, according to this, has to be verified empirically, scientifically. Like, it has to be observed. You understand? So if I say, well, I mean, this is a very obvious example, but if I say my door is brown, I have to be able to, verify that to you. If I say, I'm sick right now, or I'm happy, or anything, even every emotion has to be verified scientifically. Every claim, every statement you utter, okay, has no meaning or any sort of content or substance unless it can be tied to some sort of empirical observation justified through scientific inquiry. Okay, now you might be like, well, that's crazy. Maybe, maybe not, right? But that is one of the central beliefs. Okay, and atheists will talk like this a lot too. That's why they always ask, can you prove this? Can you provide evidence for this? Everything needs evidence, right? Scientific evidence. They're always asking for this sort of evidence. Okay, next, progressionism. Should have wrote as progressionism, but you know. Okay, so science is a cumulative enterprise where each theory builds upon prior theories in a gradual manner. Okay, before we get into definition, I have a question by Abdullah Naman. Assalamu alaikum. To avoid the problem of scientism, positivism, they reword their claim and say it's absurd to believe something ludicrous unless objective evidence for it is available. How do you respond to that? Okay, I'm trying to understand your question first. Give me a moment. You mean like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? Okay, how about this? How about we continue? I'll get back to this question later. I think you want to reword this later because you'll see how we discuss positivism at a later point. So we'll get back to this. Let's go back to progressionism first, though. Science is a cumulative enterprise where each theory builds upon prior theories in a gradual manner. I think all of you can probably admit, or at least most of you in this chat, can probably admit that this is something that you believe, that science is a cumulative process, meaning that prior theories were, they were correct to a degree. And then what happened is that some other scientists came along, they were brilliant, they found some new information, and they built upon the theories, and the theory just keeps gradually building upon itself like a building, right? Until it goes really, really high like the Burj Khalifa, okay? That's basically how people see science these days, a very gradual process, all right, in which we keep gaining knowledge and just keep getting more and more intelligent until we reach Star Trek or Star Wars, which is better. Come on, guys, you want a lightsaber, be quiet. So that's how most people think about scientism, or about science. So those are the three aspects of what scientism is. And now we're going to the history real quick. And the reason I'm trying to go so fast is because I want to leave a lot of room for discussion because we don't have much time. The subject that I'm teaching you guys, I learned myself for several years. So I'm giving you as much information as I can within this period of time so that we can have open discussion and really go through these things and flesh them out. So life of scientism. Now we're going to go into the history. And I think you guys are going to really find this fascinating because I love the history of science and history of philosophy in general because it tells you a lot about how we think and how we got to where we were or where we are today. So let's start with another awesome graphic. Boom, boom. And this guy named Friedrich Hayek died in 1992, sociologist, also philosopher. And he was the first one to really coin what scientism was. He noticed there was a big trend. Should I answer this question? I will answer that later, Brother Mohammed. Don't worry, I'll get to you. Okay, so Friedrich Hayek was really the one to kind of crystallize the definition of scientism. You don't have to write all this down, but if you want to, that'd be great. I don't know how fast you guys are typing. I'm pretty good at it. It's because all I do is sit at a desk all day. Okay, so though scientism is believed to have been understood and practiced in some form since the 17th century by the French, and that's something you should note is that the French were actually the first ones to come up with positivism as well. Get to that later. The concept and the term used to describe it was said to have been crystallized by the sociologist Friedrich Hayek. And I quote him, from the counter-revolution of science studies of the abuse of reason, he states, it needs scarcely be emphasized that nothing we shall have to say is aimed against the methods of science and their proper sphere or intended to throw the slightest doubt on their value. But to preclude any misunderstanding on this point, we shall, wherever we are concerned, not with the general spirit of disinterested inquiry, but with slavish imitation, the method and language of science, speak of scientism or the scientific prejudice. I'll explain all this later, don't worry. It should be noted that in the sense in which we shall use these terms, they describe, or of course, an attitude which is decidedly unscientific in the true sense of the word, since it involves a mechanical and uncritical application of habits of thoughts to fields different from those in which they have been formed. Okay, translation. What he's saying here is that during his time, there was a trend in which people were taking the natural sciences, okay, such as the theory of evolution, and applying it to fields outside of the scientific realm, such as sociology, which Friedrich Hayek was a part of, and history. So there were actually people who were coming up with theories of history based on evolution. Okay, things like that. people coming up with concepts, such as the French at the time during the French Empire, who were coming up with concepts about humanity. And a lot of racism was going on during this time. A lot of colonialism was being justified through the use of evolutionary concepts. For instance, Africans were seen as below everyone else. White people were seen as the highest form of evolutionary animal. Okay, and Friedrich Hayek was basically like saying, "Hey, no, bad idea. That's not how you're supposed to apply this." Okay, there's a big difference between my field of study, how humans interact with each other, how humans construct ideas and cultures and societies, and your understanding of the natural process of the world. Okay, you need to back off. That's basically what he was trying to point out. Okay, pardon my bluntness, but I'm trying to give you guys a concise form of this. So that's what he was basically saying. So he's the first one to kind of point this out and say, okay, this is an issue, and we need to stop. Now, did other people see it as well before him? Yes, but he was really the first one to kind of really define it and crystallize it. I think in French it was called Scientism, but I can't do a good French accent. So let's move on to another interesting figure, Karl Popper. Karl Popper, British philosopher, philosopher of science, came up with the concept of falsification. You hear this probably among atheists all the time. Can you falsify that? He's the one who came up with this, so blame him. Died in 1994, but he was an interesting gentleman. Let's see what he said. Sir Karl Popper, a contemporary of Hayek, would eventually become a main actor in a historical debate over the nature of science, which we will discuss later. Mostly agreed with the former's definition, though he would admit to being a follower of scientism itself in a less applicable way. He said, "But if by scientism we should mean the view that the methods of the social sciences are, to a very considerable extent, the same as those of the natural sciences, then I should be obliged to plead guilty to being an adherent of scientism. Indeed, I believe that the similarity between the social and the natural sciences can even be used for correcting wrong ideas about the natural sciences by showing that these are much more similar to the social sciences than is generally supposed." So what he said was basically, I follow scientism to a degree because I believe that the natural sciences and the social sciences can interact. He was less of a follower of scientism than what he admitted. Somebody who was a follower of scientism, dogmatic scientism, as we discussed earlier, would be somebody who sees all the other fields of knowledge, whether it be sociology, whether it be philosophy, whether it be even literature, and it can be governed by scientific principles. Whereas Karl Popper said, well, they can interact and kind of influence each other. That was really his sort of, he had a weak form of scientism. And, this is okay, but he wasn't dogmatic as many people are today. Let's go on to another gentleman, Bertrand Russell, one of my favorites. Died 1970. He was an atheist, but he was raised, I believe it was his grandmother or mother is Christian. He had a very high ethical standard. In fact, he was one of the first people, I think, if not the first person, to oppose nuclear weaponry. Yep. One of the first people during his time was like, we should not be doing this. He was very controversial for his period. Today you think about it, it's like, well, that's common sense. Back then, when they first came out with it, no. He was like, this is horrible. You should not be using these weapons. And people didn't agree with him. He was chastised for that as well. But he's an atheist. We often have negative opinions of atheists, but you have to understand that the fitra is still there for a lot of people, even if they deny it. There are a lot of people out there who practice an ethical standard because their fitra, is still there. It's still very much in them. It's trying to manifest itself. And Bertrand Russell is one of those individuals who I can say with a great deal of confidence, even though I didn't know him personally, but from what I could read from his writings and such, he was a very ethical individual, and I have high respect for him in that regard, because he was one of the first people, even before Christians were saying these things. He said, we should not have this sort of weaponry. This is horrible. And from an Islamic perspective, I don't actually know the history behind Islamic perception to nuclear weaponry, but I would assume that there was a lot of opposition to it because of how horrible it was and how it did not discriminate, against civilians. So yeah, an atheist, not a Christian, was the first to discuss this disarmament of nuclear weapons. Anyway, let's go into him. Purely dogmatic scientism, as we know today, had a humble beginning, and unfortunately, he has to be credited for this. He didn't mean to do it, though. At one point, many philosophers believed mathematics and numbers were synthetic rather than analytic. I'll discuss that. An analytical statement was that which was true by definition, whereas a synthetic statement was one which required verification external to the subject. So during his time, philosophers had this idea that there are two types of statements: analytical statements, okay, and synthetic. Analytical statements were just statements that we make that are true by definition. So, for example, a bachelor is a single man. And that would be true by definition. Okay, a synthetic statement is the grass is green. Okay, something like that. You understand? Something that can be verified, okay, based on experience. It's exactly the same as what Kant talked about, Ahmed Zishan. Assalamu alaikum. He talked about more or less experiences like he differentiated between the ontological and the phenomenal, meaning like what we experience is not the thing as it is. He would have made the same distinction between synthetic and analytical statements because they weren't actually challenged until much later. So yes, he did. Yeah, I don't know why I went into the big explanation, but yeah, it's true. So it is very similar to what Kant, actually is mostly similar to what Kant spoke about. So this is very important. This is why you guys should learn history. History should be your favorite class. Well, aside from philosophy, history should be your favorite class because it helps to explain not only where you are today, how you got here, and how we got here as a civilization, but also our ideas, how our ideas got here. Like, you can't understand Islam that much unless you understand, right, the seerah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? You just can't. You know, I mean, you can understand the doctrines, but you can't understand the ethics or why. You know, you don't really have a true understanding of it. In the same way, the ideas that you're surrounded by today, you don't understand them unless you understand history. Like, you cannot understand the modern world unless you understand what happened in World War II, because the entire world that we have today is exactly a reaction to World War II. The UN, the United Nations, that thing that doesn't work, you know, that exists because of World War II. All right, you guys need to read up on these things if you haven't already. I sound like my father. Okay, anyways, moving on. So it went on to say, because each individual aspect of every mathematical formula could not be reduced to the sum of the whole or outside experiences, given the immensity of the calculations in question, they had to be synthetic statements. So according to many philosophers during Bertrand Russell's time, mathematical like numbers themselves were actual things. Okay, like, I know that sounds weird to you, but let me just, like, if I write the number 3, okay, that backwards? Can you see it? That is backwards. Flip it around. Okay, awesome. If I write that thing itself is an actual thing floating out in some ideal world. That's how philosophers actually thought about numbers, that they're actual things, like, you know, physical objects that we cannot seem to ascertain. They weren't things that you just wrote down. They were actual objects. And they were floating around in some ideal realm. So Bertrand Russell thought this was kind of silly. And he said he would find the solution to the problem of classical mathematics being claimed as synthetic by proving that it could ultimately be reduced to logical axioms. So he said, okay, I don't think numbers are these things floating around. I think that they can be reduced to logical axioms. I think if we broke down numbers, we would find out at the end of the day that it's all logic. All numbers are logic. Okay? And then he would prove that they were actually analytical, meaning that numbers were true by definition, not by being out there somewhere. And if you're wondering, like, why they were confused about this problem and why this is an issue, you're about to find out. In other words, he would prove that it was merely a symbolic relationship, true only by virtue of the definitions placed within, thereby destroying the claim of mathematics as being their own separate reality. And he did. In his famous work, Principia Mathematica, he actually proved that all mathematics can be reduced to logical axioms. And that is awesome, and I'll tell you why it's awesome, because his work was the foundation for computer science. If we have any computer programmers in here, the reason that you have programming language is because of him, a philosopher by the name of Bertrand Russell. If it had not been for his work, you would not have C++ and whatever code you use today, because he proved that mathematics was reduced to logical axioms. So give him credit for that. He didn't mean to do it, but give him credit for that. However, by doing this, by proving this, he opened the doors for other people to think about things in a different way as well, in not so good fashion. In the same way, or the same vein, Russell opened the doors for other beliefs to be challenged that were considered to be synthetic, such as the supernatural, i.e. God. So now they're thinking, well, if numbers can be reduced to logical statements, what about everything else that we can't see and observe? Right? Let's move on. Next. This guy, we come to Ludwig Wittgenstein, died in 1951. The most eccentric person you will ever meet in your life, at least according to his friends and his own writings. He was also perhaps one of the most arrogant people that ever lived, but it was in a kind of a quirky way, a funny way. He literally believed that he had solved every problem in philosophy after he wrote like 30 pages of notes. I'm reading, oh yes. Sorry, I'm just reading the chat here. So he believed that he had solved all problems of philosophy. And what's interesting is that him and Bertrand Russell were actually friends. And Ludwig Wittgenstein was actually a little younger than him. And he basically wrote these notes during wartime. He wrote them in a battlefield. Like when he was on his off time, he was writing these notes. He was a brilliant mind, okay, but he was very eccentric, very kind of crazy in his own little way. And very, very, you couldn't even argue with him because he was so like, I am right, you know, you're wrong. And him and Bertrand Russell used to be like complete opposites of each other, but they used to get along for some reason. Anyways, so he wrote this work and he tried to send it in to Bertrand Russell. He said, look, I solved all the problems of philosophy, give me my PhD. And Bertrand Russell was like, this isn't a thesis. It's 30 pages of like notes. You know, it was called the Tractatus. And he denied Ludwig Wittgenstein his PhD. And then eventually Ludwig Wittgenstein was like, okay, well, since I solved all the problems of philosophy, I have nothing else to do in life. And he became a grammar teacher. And then after that, some philosophers picked up his work and started using his ideas. And then Bertrand Russell was like, okay, let's give this guy a PhD. And that was that. Now, it gets more funny after this, too. So let's read this part first. A young philosopher contemporary to Bertrand Russell who goes on to advance the latter's work concluded the following from Bertrand Russell. So he read Bertrand Russell's work, and then he improved upon it, and then he stated the following. Okay, let's see. Another question first. Are the logical truths themselves a priori because they too are analytic? What makes them so? A priori. We're not going to discuss a priori in here. This is more regarding like, it'll be in a future class. I might answer that one later. Okay, so let's read what he wrote in, this is basically his thesis summarized. The right method of philosophy would be this, to say nothing except what can be said, i.e. the propositions of natural science, i.e. something that has nothing to do with philosophy. And then always when someone else wished to say something metaphysical or non-observable, to demonstrate to him that he had given no meaning to certain signs in his propositions, this method would be unsatisfying to others. He would not have the feeling that we were teaching him philosophy, but it would be the only strictly correct method. So basically what he was saying is that nothing has any meaning, essentially, unless it can be empirically verified by scientific observation, by science itself. Okay, another question before we go on. You guys are really throwing really good questions at me. So let me read this one real quick. Can we import scientific theories to the Muslim world uncritically and teach them in our schools, or should there be a review to ascertain their compliance with the Islamic worldview? We will discuss that at a later point as well. I have prepared myself for all of you guys. You have no idea. Okay, my mind works like clockwork. All right, trust me, we'll talk about that. If your questions are in relation to the material that I have here present, please ask it now so I can answer. But if it's something that's coming in your back of your mind, like I want to know this right now, I don't care if he gets to it or not yet, please save it for a little later, and we'll definitely get into it. Like, I'm not trying to avoid your questions, I promise. But you really need to understand this part, because this is very, very, very important to understanding how people think today. Okay, so after writing this, the Tractatus, he got his PhD, and he basically reduced all statements to analytical statements. In other words, any statement lacking any observable evidence based in science should be rendered as meaningless, because statements can only have meaning if they actually point to something in reality. Statements are only analytic and without content otherwise. So he basically said that every statement that you ever make is analytic until it can be proven. That's it. Every statement you say, this is Wittgenstein, every statement you say has no real content, no real substance outside of its own definition, unless you can point to something in reality. Okay? That's what he said. So if you say something like love, Wittgenstein would be like, what is that? Like, what are you talking about? Where is it? Does that sound like some of the atheists you talk to today? Okay, let's keep going. So let's get to A.J. Ayer. All right. And he's going to be one of the proponents of a movement that came after Ludwig Wittgenstein, because Wittgenstein influenced a movement after he made this statement, after he made these claims. He influenced a movement called the logical positivist. And one of the leading proponents of logical positivism was A.J. Ayer, and we'll get to Willard Quine and all them later. So let's go to A.J. Ayer first. A.J. Ayer was a British philosopher, one of the leading proponents of the movement known as logical positivism. He died in 1989. He was actually a very interesting individual, very quiet. Apparently, he was a ladies' man. I know that's haram, but I'm just telling you because he doesn't look the type. But he was a very charming person, and considered a gentleman among many. If I happen to recall, I think he actually got into a fight with, who was it? Was it Mike Tyson? Not in a physical fight. I think he got into a verbal altercation with Mike Tyson. I'm not joking. You can look it up. Don't tell me how it happened. It just did. Okay, so apparently Mike Tyson was doing something bad, trying to impose himself upon a woman. And A.J. Ayer walked into the room during a party, and he said, "What are you doing? This is wrong." And then he tried to talk to Mike Tyson. He talked him out of it, and apparently they became friends. I know it's weird, just it's true though. So anyways, a British philosopher and one of the leading proponents of the movement known as logical positivism would carry on Wittgenstein's views, being the last philosopher to try and defend the following statement. So the statement he came up with was the following: we say that a sentence is factually significant to any given person if and only if he knows how to verify the proposition which he purports to express. So basically he was saying that no statement has any sort of meaning whatsoever unless he can verify that through some sort of some sort of, what's the word? If it can be verified physically through empirical observation. Okay. I have another question here. Real quick, for future classes, please give us some reading material before the lectures so that it's easier for us to understand stuff when you were talking. I apologize. I did send in an introduction for reading material. I don't know if it was posted on the website. That said, it should be up there now. I do apologize in advance once again to all of you. I was actually extremely ill a week ago. I'm not trying to make you feel bad, but just bear with me. I had a minor heart attack last week, so I'm just kind of like recovering. I know it doesn't look like it, right? Yeah. That's because I'm so interested in the subject. But in any regard, I do apologize for that. And I hope that, like I said, if you have any questions regarding this material right now, if you need me to explain more things, please, ask those questions about this material so that we can continue. Like I said, if you're stuck on something, just ask, and I'll do my best to explain it to you. Okay, so yeah, so that's what he said. In other words, a statement has meaning if and only if it can be empirically verified by science or is true by definition. What Ayer would fail to realize later was that this very statement of verification was self-refuting. And this is where it gets funny, because the entire philosophical school of logical positivism would eventually fall to pieces. Because the very statement itself, the very thing in which they needed to verify things, the statement itself that and no statement has meaning unless it can be empirically verified, could not itself be empirically verified. There you go. It's done, right? Self-refuting. And throughout the rest of his career, he tried to solve this dilemma. It's like, well, okay, well, if all statements are analytic and we can't prove them unless it can be empirically verified, but the very statement itself, the very claim of verification itself cannot be verified, then what are we doing? Okay, next question. What is tautological? It means it's true by definition. It's just true. A single man is a single man. That's tautological. You see what I'm saying? Definitions in and of themselves. Something that is true by definition. It doesn't need any sort of external sources. Muhammad Zia, assalamu alaikum. This is a good question. Some of the mutakalim use syllogism based on pure reason to prove the existence of God. Since, according to Ludwig Wittgenstein, each proposition of the syllogism would have to be proven empirically, would this mean that he would reject any proofs for the existence of God? Yes. And this is what the logical positivists did. They rejected all metaphysical assumptions. Every single thing you can think of. It doesn't matter. You could put the teleological argument, you could put the cosmological argument. They looked at it and they said, it's not observable. We reject it. It's meaningless. So let's see what happened. After they all realized, now here's an extra funny thing too, by the way. I didn't mention in the slides here. Ludwig Wittgenstein would eventually reject his own propositions. He would eventually redo his entire philosophy. He would get rid of it entirely, and he would be the first one to point this out, that there was a problem. So after all these years writing all these notes, doing it during wartime and trying to get his PhD and saying that he had solved all the problems, he eventually, a couple of years later, he was like, hey guys, I was wrong. Sorry, my bad. And then he fought against his own philosophy. So that tells you something of how eccentric he was. But he was a brilliant mind. So let's see how this philosophy eventually got completely and utterly destroyed. It wasn't just because it was self-refuting, but it was something else. And we're going to go now to the American philosophers. And this is about the only thing I like about America, are the American philosophers in the pragmatist tradition. And we're going to start with an individual by the name of Willard Quine, who died in 2000. And in the American tradition of philosophy, it's very different from British. In a way, it's like they focus on different problems. In the American version of philosophy, it was more about practical things. What can we use? What can we do with this? You know what I mean? Whereas the British philosophers were more like trying to figure out issues of truth and justification. And American philosophers was like, look, I just want something I can do with it. Okay? And you have to give them some credit, because the thing is, they really broke down what the problems were with this philosophy. So let's see what Willard Quine did. So despite the fact that the principle of verification was self-refuting, there was more to argue against regarding the logical positives, understanding of science, and justification in general. Willard Quine, an American pragmatist philosopher of science, would eventually show that the reductionist view of science promoted by the likes of A.J. Ayer was ultimately a flawed understanding of science. Okay, so what is reductionist? He goes on to say, the totality of our so-called knowledge or beliefs is a man-made fabric, which impinges on experience only along the edges. Okay, so before going into this more detail, basically, remember, the logical positivists believe that nothing had meaning unless it can be empirically verified. So it had to correspond with something outside, right? Statement corresponds with reality. Okay, so it would be reduced. So a statement could literally be reduced into like the smallest format, if it could be empirically verified. So if I said, I have a lock on my door, okay, all I have to do is show you the lock on my door. Okay, that's it, done. You understand the statement, okay? But what Quine said was something else. He said, look, you can't do that because statements aren't just understood by what they correspond to. There's more to understanding a statement or understanding something in general than just pointing at an object. So I'm going to give you an example, okay? A statement, I need to fix the lock on my door before I go to work today. Very simple statement, right? But it's really not, if you think about it. See, let me try to reduce that statement by asking a question. Why do you need to fix the lock on your door? I answer the question, because my lock is broken. I ask another question. What do you mean it's broken? Well, it's broken. It doesn't lock anymore. And I say, okay, why do you need to fix it? Because I need to protect my things while I'm gone. Why do you need to protect your things? You see where I'm going with this? You can't keep reducing it. It's irreducible. It keeps going around and around because within these statements that we make in our daily lives, there's more to knowledge than what it corresponds to directly in empirical observation. There's more to meaning than that. So here's a personal example. When I was living in Malaysia for almost a decade doing my studies there, and I remember I had some neighbors from a rural part of Nigeria. Okay, let me see here. A rural part of Nigeria, and they didn't have this concept of locks in their mind. They didn't understand what locks meant because, well, and I learned this the hard way. I went out one day just to go get some food. I came back and I found out that my door was open and some of my stuff was gone, like my kitchen supplies, they were gone. I was wondering why, and I found some of the kids playing with them, and I was wondering, okay, what are you doing with my stuff, you know? And he didn't understand. He was one of the children of my Nigerian neighbor. He didn't understand, and you know, this kept going on for quite some time. And eventually, I confronted his father, and I said, "Look, this has been going on." And I started locking my door after that. But eventually, I would unlock it sometimes, and they would still come and do things. And I thought, I just want to tell you, I'm sorry to say this, but your son's kind of stealing from me. No offense. I know he's young; he doesn't know any better. But I just want to inform you. And he said, "Oh, I'm sorry." And he explained to me that the reason why he's doing this is because in his village in Nigeria, the families there don't have locks. They share the materials. They go into each other's houses and take things and come out. It's normal. They even share the kids. And it's like, for them, that the concept of a lock is very alien. You know what I mean? So if you told them that statement, they wouldn't understand what you're saying. Because their entire culture is not based around this concept of privacy or private property. In the West, it's different. We have this concept. So in that way, that kind of gives an example that you can't reduce these statements to anything because they're within the context of a completely different system of understanding. And this is what Quine pointed out. He said, we don't live in statements. We don't live in facts that are, just there. We live in this whole web of knowledge that contextualizes everything that we say and do, right? He would say that, in other words, knowledge was holistic and contextualized based on the world in which we lived and understood things. So it can't be just reduced to logical axioms. You can't just say, oh, we found it, there it is, therefore it's all solved. Because it corresponds, our entire interpretation of reality is this big web. It's not just statements or words or letters, right? Okay, so let's move on. Now, he was kind of the first to kind of bring this concept to light, but the person who really shut down logical positivism single-handedly was my favorite philosopher by the name of Thomas Kuhn. You saw his quote in the beginning. And he is perhaps one of the most influential people in the world today. He died, of course, very recently. But he's not spoken about very much. But he is very influential in all fields of knowledge. And he has done a lot for the world in terms of understanding of science and our understanding of just reality. And he was a historian, but he came up with the scientific theory. And I'm just going to read his profile here. Thomas Kuhn, another American pragmatist who attended the same university as Quine and would subsequently be influenced by the latter, typo, advanced the idea of the holistic understanding of knowledge in his famous work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And I believe in the introduction to this course, or this module, I gave this book as pre-reading material. Kuhn made three major points in his analysis of scientific history. The first is that science operates based on paradigms. Everyone in this room, I think, knows the word paradigm. Guess what? This guy, Thomas Kuhn, is the one who coined the term. He's the one who came up with the word. So you guys saying, oh, this is the paradigm, this paradigm. You see people in the media talking about paradigms. Him. He's the reason. Okay? The first is that science operates based on paradigms or holistic, culturally inherited theories that help us to make sense of experiences. So a paradigm is basically a worldview. Like the Islamic worldview is a paradigm. Okay? The second is that most applied science that makes anything close to progress, what he calls normal science, is mainly about solving puzzles within a given paradigm. So what he says is that all the science we do today, like you see people doing experiments, they're operating by a certain paradigm. Okay, a certain paradigm about reality. A certain paradigm, even like sub-paradigms, like a certain understanding of how physics works, right? Like today we have something called quantum physics. Scientists work within that paradigm of physics, okay? And he would say that these people are doing normal science. So they're working within this little paradigm. They're not challenging the paradigm, they're working within it. So all the experimentation, all the academic articles, all the research is done within a specific paradigm. Even in biology, evolution is what? It's not just a theory, it's also a paradigm. Okay? And third, there are paradigm shifts or revolutions which result from normal science's inability to solve the anomalies faced by an established paradigm. What does this mean? Okay, basically he found out that once a paradigm becomes very successful, say evolution or something else, gravity, things like this, what happens eventually is that there are some problems. Scientists begin to observe things that are not normal, meaning that they're not in accordance with the paradigm, meaning that they don't work as they should. Like if a paradigm says it should be like this, for some reason, something they've observed does something completely different. And they're like, okay, why does this happen? And they start to encounter more and more of these issues. Like the more data they collect, the more the anomalies or the changes, the differences become more and more like strenuous to the theory. So the theory becomes heavier and heavier, it becomes more convoluted, more complex. And the scientists keep tweaking the theory, like they keep changing little parts of it, saying, okay, well, a good example is evolution. So for example, it was kind of simple in the beginning, and now they're kind of giving more explanations to it to try to explain some things they keep finding that aren't going to plan. You know what I'm saying? So they keep tweaking things. And they keep saying, well, there's an issue here, so we got to change this. Let's move this around. Maybe it's not like this, so let's change the theory a little bit like this. And And this keeps going and going until finally somebody sits down and goes, hey guys, this is way too complex now, and I think it can be more simple than this. And they go, okay, here's a new paradigm. Boom. This is more simple. This solves all the problems. Let's switch to this. And there's historical examples of this happening. This is the reason he came up with this is because his primary example was, let's see, new question. Okay, Ahmed Faraz, salam alaikum. Like, for example, the tree of life becoming the web of life, is that a tweak in the theory? Yes, it is. Common ancestry theories have been changing dramatically because they keep finding things that don't go to plan. You see what I'm saying? Now, this happens within every major theory, to be honest. It doesn't mean, we're going to talk about what a theory is in a moment. It doesn't mean that the theory is wrong, okay? It just means that the theory is not entirely able to explain the data. Okay, so let's keep going though. So, for example, his example was he looked at the Ptolemaic system and the Copernican system. So heliocentric versus geocentric. Okay, geocentric system was basically what? The Earth was the center of the galaxy, the universe, right? Heliocentric, the sun is the center, right? Okay. So what happened? This was a paradigm shift, and what happened was that Ptolemy, he explained the universe in this way. It was basically like the planets and everything in the sun were rotating around the Earth, and sometimes the motions of the Earth of the planets would be kind of erratic. It'd be kind of weird. So he explained it like, okay, it must be that way because not only are the planets and the sun going like this, but they're also kind of going like this, right? Like little circles. Okay, epicycles. I think I have a diagram. Let me show you. Boom, there it is. It's horribly, horribly blurry. Okay, so the geocentric system is here. And if you can see on the left side, so basically all these planets and the sun would rotate around the Earth, not just in one circular fashion, but they would do epicycles. So squigglies. And one day, a lot of scientists came along and said, even from the Islamic tradition, by the way, mainly the first people to question the Ptolemaic system were scientists from the Islamic tradition, like Al-Kushti, who was the first one to advance the idea that the Earth was not stationary. In actuality, it rotated. So Copernicus got a lot of his ideas from Muslim philosophers and Muslim scientists. And eventually what happened was that all of these problems kept adding up. Like there was just too much stuff. Like, why is it this complicated? And we still can't understand why the planets are moving in certain ways. Like there's like Venus and Mercury were still kind of acting weird, you know? So why this epicycles, there's got to be another problem. So they kept trying to add more things and it just got more and more confusing. And then eventually somebody said, you know, I have an idea. Maybe instead of putting the Earth in the center, let's put the sun in the center and see how it works. And guess what? All of those little squiggly lines went away. And then scientists were like, this makes more sense. And they adopted the heliocentric system. Now, according to many atheists today, the only way to understand or to justify a theory or to justify the way something works is if it's directly observable, or you know, if you can actually see what's going on. Like basically, Copernicus would have to go up into space and like observe directly this phenomenon, but he didn't. He only proposed this theory because why? Because it was to solve. Let's go back to solve the issues with the Ptolemaic system, this geocentric system. So Thomas Kuhn was, when he published this work, he was very famous for it, and he changed the way in which we understood science as not being this gradual process of events, of data collection and theories building upon each other. He also revealed that knowledge was holistic. It wasn't reducible to like logical axioms, like just observable phenomenon, and that in fact theories were not direct representations of the world that we know it. Theories, in a way, were more or less like commentaries or explanations about how the data should look. So say you have all this data, all this observational data that you have, and what he said was basically a theory is just taking all that data together and trying to make it fit like a puzzle in the right places. That's it. And the way I like to define a theory is as a tafsir. Okay, a theory, a scientific theory, essentially to the scientific community is what we consider to be a tafsir. Okay, like the tafsir to the Quran, to the scientific community, a theory is a tafsir to the world. Okay, now, essentially, then science is not. Does it accurately depict all of reality? No, because every theory has its own share of problems, which we eventually have to correct, right? And every theory has a new model for things. So how can it be progressing if every new theory is different from the last one, right? It doesn't take from it. It literally is a different thing. Like the geocentric system was the Earth was the center, right? And then this heliocentric was the sun was the center. That's a completely different paradigm, correct? So it's not progressive. It's not even realism. It's not even tied to reality because the theory itself is only constructed to make sense of what we see. It doesn't actually explain the exact representation of reality itself. If that were the case, then Copernicus would have never come up with this theory, right? He literally was sitting at a desk when he came up with this theory. How did he do it? If he had to directly observe what was in front of him, if it was reality itself, that he was observing, he didn't. He came up with it in his mind to solve these dilemmas. So this was essentially the end of positivism at that point. Unfortunately, it was only the end of positivism and scientism in the academic sense. Okay, so anonymous attendee, assalamu alaikum. Can we say that naturalism is a paradigm and Darwinian evolution is a physical explanation of the reality? The paradigm is to explain everything without invoking the divine. Yes, we can. Naturalism is a sort of a meta paradigm. Naturalism is a paradigm, and we could say that Darwinian evolution, I just prefer to say evolution because we've moved quite a long ways since Darwin. The evolutionary theory now is not very similar to Darwin's. I mean, similar in some respects, but they've changed a lot. So evolution would be a theory, a physical explanation of the reality that we see, but it's not the reality. So it's not a realistic. Now, people who follow scientism will say it is, and we're about to debate that in a moment. Because if you've been following this history, you'll see that Kuhn et al. Basically destroyed this understanding of science already. So why is it still here? Okay, well, we're going to explain that. Especially, why is it among atheists? Well, you see, when something is destroyed in the academic arena, when something is debated in the academic arena, it doesn't always transfer to the society, especially today. Not only that, but atheists were the first ones to sort of come back and revive scientism. And we're about to find out who did, who was the first one to do it. Okay, so let's see who's next. Antony Flew. Who knows Antony Flew? I'm sure a lot of you do. You might have read his books. He is a famous philosopher in the 1970s, atheist who became a deist because he believed in these so-called scientific miracles of existence that led him to believe in God. And he eventually wrote a book about it, and then he passed away in 2010. He was also a very charming individual, a very good person, a very good philosopher. But he came up with something very interesting. I don't know if you've heard all this, but you're about to find out. Oh, also, George Smith came after him. And then you have Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Victor Stenger. So this is the Isnad. Okay? We're about to complete our Isnad, right? Antony Flew, possibly the most famous atheist of the 20th century, who would later eventually become a deist, was the first to construct the idea, yes, there is a God, was the name of Antony Flew's book. See, you guys know. You just never knew the history, huh? I'm connecting all the dots for you now. Before we go on, another comment, anonymous attendee. Can we still benefit from theories if they are not so definitive? Yes, of course. We can. Because the data itself is still true. What we observe is still a thing. How we interpret it is the issue. Okay, so a commentary can assist you in reading the Quran, for instance, right? But there are still differences of opinions within those commentaries. You see what I'm saying? Okay. So here we go. Let me continue reading with Antony Flew. Possibly the most famous atheist of the 20th century, would later eventually become a deist, was the first to construct the idea of weak, negative, and strong positive atheism, the former of which he promoted as the presumption of atheism. And his reason for the construction of these labels are as follows. What the protagonist of the presumption of atheism, in my sense, wants to show is that the debate about the existence of God ought to be conducted in a particular way, and that the issue should be seen in a certain perspective. His thesis about the onus of proof it is up to the theist first to introduce and to defend his proposed concept of God, and second to provide sufficient reason for believing that his concept of his does in fact have an application. Okay, translation. You know how atheists tell you today that they lack a belief in God? He's the one. He's the reason. He's the reason. He did not change. Another question. Did Flew change his mind on the presumption of atheism once he became a deist? No, he did not. In fact, he followed this presumption, and that's why he became a deist. I don't actually agree with the reason he became a deist, by the way. Just throwing it out there. But he was very consistent with his principles. As somebody who has studied the philosophy of science, we can discuss this at a later point. I am not a fan of believing in God on the basis of so-called scientific miracles. I think that is a false understanding of how to come to God's existence. That's all I'll say. We can discuss that at a later point, but I'm just giving you a clue as to right now, because if you understand what science is, you will not come to that conclusion. Right? Okay. We'll discuss that later. So anyways, he said that basically he came up with the idea of lacking belief in God. He said atheists don't, there are strong atheists, positive atheists who believe that God doesn't exist, but there are also weak or negative atheists like myself and other people, that's what he said, or most atheists, who just lack a belief. Therefore, the default position is atheism, and you have to prove to us that God exists. That's what Antony Flew came up with. Okay, and he calls it the presumption of atheism. Now, another philosopher came along. Now, Antony Flew, by the way, did not assume that the presumption could be met through science alone. He believed that philosophical inquiry or philosophical argument could also be used to prove God's existence. But somebody else came along, another philosopher who followed his lectures, and decided to revive scientism as a result of this. His name was George Smith. He's not very well known, but he's the reason for everyone else below him. Okay? George Smith, another atheist philosopher who was influenced by Antony Flew's new understanding of atheism, would advance the latter's ideas in such a way that he would provide the foundation for contemporary atheist thought. If you want to know why contemporary atheists believe what they believe today, he's your man. He's not, like I said, he's not well known, but I have searched far and wide for the persons who gave, for the people who gave the ideas to Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, etc., and this is him. Okay. Like I said, this is why you should study history and the philosophy of idea and philosophy of history and things like this, because then you can figure out where these ideas are coming from. Where Flew might accept philosophical argument to oppose his presumption of atheism, Smith believed that it was impossible to do so, and I quote from his book, Atheism, the Case Against God, probably his only published work. Naturalism has the priority over supernaturalism, not because it is the more economical of two explanations, but because it is the only framework in which explanation is possible. The contest between naturalism and supernaturalism is not a battle between two rival modes of explanation. Naturalism is the only context in which the concept of explanation has meaning. What does that sound like? Logical positivism. But instead of saying that the statement has no meaning until it's empirically verified, what he's saying is what? An explanation has no meaning unless it's empirically verified. Abdullah Rahman, salam alaikum. What does lacking a belief even mean? That's a good question. What does lacking a belief mean? To give you a brief, lacking belief can be meant in two ways. A lack of belief can be meant as having no awareness of the belief whatsoever, like being a rock or a tree, or being a baby even. I mean, even the babies have fitra, but they don't really comprehend God. You know, they don't understand what that means. They have an inclination towards it, but they don't, you know, a baby's born, they don't understand God like we do. Or a lack of belief can mean that I just don't believe it because I don't have a reason to. A suspension of judgment is usually how atheists refer to as is. A lack of belief is a suspension of judgment, like I just don't know. So, you know, like if I say I don't know, basically it's their way of saying I don't know, is I lack a belief. It can be used as a defense mechanism. Now, if you want to get really deep into it, so Abu Faris, salam alaikum. What are your views on negative atheism as an intellectual position? Does it have intellectual cogency, or is it simply an obfuscation? It is a position in the sense of being a state of being, but not as in like a proposition itself. And I was about to explain what I mean by that in a moment. So, for example, if I lack a belief in God, there has to be a reason for that, right? Not just because I'm unaware, because I'm obviously aware of God or the concept of God if I say I lack a belief in God, right? So what does it mean to lack a belief in that sense? It means that, well, I don't have evidence or I don't have a reason, right? So there, now you're seeing positive beliefs. It's no longer a negative belief. Now it's a positive. So the lacking itself might be negative, but the positive aspects, there are positive aspects behind it. You can't lack something without having a reason for it, right? Like if I say I lack a belief in Bigfoot, and somebody says why, I'm going to tell you, well, I don't have evidence. There's no reason for me to, right? But then you can ask other questions. Well, what do you mean by evidence? What do you mean by reason, right? Lacking a belief doesn't make you rational by default. And I wish, actually, I had a video I was going to show you, but I thought it would take too long. And I've been talking so much, taking up so much time, so we're not going to see it anyway. But let me give you an example. Flat earthers, people who believe in a flat earth, they lack belief in that the earth is round. There you go. But nobody calls them rational. I wonder why. So, but there are reasons why they lack a belief, right? Because they don't understand science, maybe. They don't understand what they're asking for in terms of evidence. In the same way, I treat atheists like this. I treat atheists like they're flat earthers. I consider them the metaphysical flat earthers. Okay, like they always ask, well, there's no reason to believe in God. I don't try to provide reasons to them. Then I don't try to provide evidence, because you know what I first do? I question their reasons. I question why they lack belief. Most people don't do that these days. First thing they do is they go straight to the arguments, like Ustaz Hamza was telling you. You know, they go on the defensive, right? No. If your skepticism is ridiculous, there's no reason for me to answer you. If you tell me, for instance, I lack belief that this is reality, what am I going to do? You know, you want me to answer that? That's ridiculous. That's nonsense. You know, there's a certain proposition, certain forms of skepticism that are just nonsensical. What would be the point of even going into it? In the same way I treat atheists. They hate it when I do that because they feel like they're so superior intellectually. But with their understanding of science, when they say, I want evidence for God's existence through scientific inquiry, and I say, do you understand science? Because you wouldn't be asking me that question if you did. Anonymous attendee, assalamu alaikum. What is the difference between positive and negative atheism? As I've already said, negative atheism is a lack of belief. It means that I don't have, I don't know if I believe or not. It's sort of like agnosticism, okay? And then, in fact, it is agnosticism, but this would replace it later. So Flew eventually would say agnosticism is nonsense. It's just a form of atheism. It's a negative atheism. And positive atheism or strong atheism is basically, I do not believe God exists, meaning that there's a firm belief that God does not exist. Okay, there is a difference between those two. There's a major difference. Another question: Why, by anonymous attendee, Assalamu alaikum, why is naturalism considered superior to supernaturalism? Because according to, I don't believe that, but according to Smith, it's because it's the only context in which we can understand anything. You look around the world, you don't see the supernatural, right? You don't see God, you don't see angels, you don't see jinn, you don't see anything. You only see what? Grass, trees, my house, a computer screen. That's all you see. So according to Smith, because that's your only point of reference, that makes it superior. According to Smith. Now, I actually have arguments against Smith's arguments, more detailed ones on my website, asadullahali.com. You can go on there and find my article. I probably link it later in the course module introduction. I didn't think we were going to get into the discussion, but where I basically show why his argument is false. I go into more detail and I prove that it's wrong. And I'll give you a concise format here. Basically, he says that because this is the only context in which we live, that we can't presume that there's a God, right? I actually accept his argument, and I say this. I say, okay, well, if that's true, if it's true that this is the only point of reference that we have, then in fact, you're wrong, because then we shouldn't even think about God. There should be no mention of God. The whole concept of God shouldn't even come into our minds if this is all we can perceive and understand. If this is the only context in which we can explain anything, then the concept of a transcendent being who is beyond the physical characteristics of the natural world shouldn't even pop into our minds. That's my explanation, or my argument. It's sort of like a reverse ontological argument. I think it's very good, but whatever. That's not the point of this lecture. You guys can judge it for yourself. Excuse me. So he revived this sort of scientific understanding and verificationism through the idea of explanation. Instead of statements requiring meaning in order to be instead of statements requiring verification, physical phenomena in order to have meaning, he instead said explanation. So now it's no longer self-refuting. Okay, but there are some major problems with it. Anonymous attendees, do you believe atheists actually exist, or do you believe they don't exist in the true sense? I believe that everyone's upon the fitra. So I believe that atheists are going through cognitive dissonance. And in fact, this is a proven fact. If you look up any study on the nature of belief today, there are only two types of people who are atheist in the explicit sense. One, normally mentally healthy individuals who continuously reminded of the natural inclination to believe that there's purpose and design in the world. Okay, the atheists will complain themselves about this, like, oh, they even talk like this. They feel like they always talk like there's purpose out there. They can't get rid of it. You'll see a lot of articles online in this respect as well. Atheists complaining about this natural inclination, but they'll just sort of write it off and say, well, it doesn't prove anything. That's just an evolutionary trait that I have because my ancestors, developed this thing because to warn themselves of predators around them, so they saw intention and purpose everywhere, things like this. So that's what it is. That's the reason it came about. So they'll try to explain it through some sort of evolutionary byproduct. And then you have another group, which is basically people with autism. Asperger's is one of the two. I'm sorry, I'm not thinking very clearly right now. But people with mental deficiencies in certain regards people who have difficulty empathizing or sympathizing with others or understanding human emotion. They tend to be atheists very easily. People who are very technical. I think it's Asperger's, or is it autistic? Whatever. They tend to be more inclined towards that. And you can actually see this on the online world as well. If you notice, I think it's Asperger's, yeah. Some people are pretty much borderline Asperger's, because if you notice how people interpret scripture, they do it in such a way that it's almost like they can't understand metaphor. They can't understand context. They can't understand holistic understanding of the text. And they tend to be atheist. So when you wonder why atheists like to cherry pick passages from the Quran and present them in like this matter of fact way, it might have more to do with them having a certain condition. I'm not saying all of them, but there might be a sizable minority that are like that. And there are studies out there that show that people with Asperger's and even autism, I think, are more prone to be atheists. And these are some of the traits that they have, is that they read everything very literalistically. So just something to remember, something to note. All right, so George Smith was the one to revive scientism among society and especially the atheist community. We have about 25 minutes here, and I want to save some time for more question and answers. So we're going to get to the end and maybe even explain some Islamic history as well. I gave you guys an article in the introduction that you can read.